Hello, everybody. This is David Hamilton. I'm a partner in the antitrust practice in the Baltimore office of DLA Piper. This is our next installation of our antitrust podcast, which is called Pricing Rules. And as the name suggests, we talk about pricing a lot on our podcast. In this podcast, we're going to tackle the Robinson-Patman Act. And there's been recent interest by the government and by private litigants in the enforcement of the statute and investigations. I'm going to introduce our panel first briefly, go into the topic a little bit more, and then the panelists are going to introduce themselves in greater depth. So I'm happy to be joined by Christina DePasquale, who's a Carey Business School and Johns Hopkins University professor of economics. I'm also happy to be joined by my friend Patrick Miller. Patrick is a co-founder of Flywheel Digital, and he'll explain that. Also happy to be joined by John Johnson, who's the CEO of Edgeworth Economics. He's both an economist and an expert witness with an incredibly successful track record. And my partner, David Bamberger, who's going to talk about defending private litigation and government investigations centered around the RPA. So the RPA is a Depression-era statute that focuses on unfair price discrimination. And I put the word unfair in as a modifier. It does not appear in the statute, but generally speaking, that's how it's been interpreted. And what we're going to talk about today is the history and purpose of the statute, some industry practices and insight from Patrick, and then David and John are going to have a dialogue about litigation issues. So let me turn it first to Christina to introduce yourself in a little greater detail than I did.
Thanks for having me, Christina DePasquale. As you said, I'm an associate professor in economics at the Carey Business School at Johns Hopkins University. Most of my research has some sort of an antitrust component to it. A lot of my research recently has been in writing about the Robinson-Patman Act. What used to be seen as sort of a niche area to write about has become, fortunately, a little bit more popular in recent years from my research standpoint. So that's been a positive about the renewed interest.
Patrick.
Hi there, Patrick Miller. I co-founded Baltimore-based Flywheel Digital about 10 years ago, and we're now a part of Omnicom, which is North America's largest purchaser of media. And Flywheel is a retail and technology company, build all of our own bidders into our technology, and we happen to also buy a lot of media. And we operate at the intersection of e-commerce, retail, and media, trying to add value to brands.
Thanks, Patrick. John?
My name is John Johnson. I am a professional economist and an expert on particularly what is called econometrics, which is the application of economics to large data sets. Very large part of my practice is in the antitrust area, where I generally have testified as an expert on price fixing, on monopolization. And again, this renewed interest in Robinson-Patman Act has also just recently happened, but is also a topic of my work.
And David.
Thanks, David. I'm an antitrust partner in the DLA Piper, Washington, D.C. office. My practice is largely civil litigation, and I've had a subspecialty working on Robinson-Patman Act matters for 20 plus years.
Okay, let's start. Christina, you either volunteered or you've been drafted to be one of the proponents of the Robinson-Patman Act statute. I'm going to put you on your back foot a little bit at the outset, given some of the commentary that I see in the research and reference works that I use to prepare for this. First, I'm looking at a paper that says that the Robinson-Patman Act is the single most unpopular antitrust law among practitioners and scholars in the field. I'm also looking at a quote that says that Judge Robert Bork disparaged the statute as the typhoid Mary of antitrust. I'm also looking at another paper that says the Robinson-Patman Act, it's worse than you think. I could go on. It is not a very favored statute. So with that in mind, let's start at the beginning and try to deal with the purpose, and then maybe you can bring it forward and how you see the statute in beneficial ways for consumers or for businesses.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say I've more been drafted probably. But I think like most economists, everything does have trade-offs. And while the negative effects are pretty well documented, I think that the potential positive effects are not zero. And I will go into that in a little bit more detail. But starting from why do we even have this? It was a response initially to firms that we were worried about had too much market power. Those who were competing with the A&P back in the 30s were tired of not being able to compete with them. And just thinking of it from even that standpoint, this idea of, do we want to protect small businesses? That benefits not only those businesses, but does that benefit those consumers who shop there? And that ultimately is what becomes the complicated question. But that is what motivated the law to begin with. This idea that should we protect competitors? And that is what the Robinson-Patman Act aims to do. It aims to essentially level the playing field by limiting larger businesses from aggressive pricing tactics that might put those smaller businesses out of business. Now, that sentence by itself is where the rub is with most people. This idea of, does protecting competitors actually come at the expense of competition? So when we think of our goals of antitrust policy in general, the goals of antitrust policy should be to promote competition. And sometimes that doesn't go hand in hand with protecting competitors. When we say aggressive pricing, what do we mean? What kind of pricing were these businesses trying to get protection from? Well, larger businesses typically are able to secure lower prices from those who supply to them, and then can price lower to their consumers as well. If that gets too aggressive, that can put those small businesses out of business. Now, when we think about the goal of antitrust policy to protect consumers or to protect consumer welfare, we like low prices. Consumers like low prices. So the general welfare question is, can we protect small businesses while also keeping those prices low for consumers? I think looking a little bit ahead to today, not to jump forward too much, the FTC and I believe the Biden executive order promoting competition is making an inherent assumption that those two things go hand in hand. That might not be true, though. If we actually play it out, it's the larger retailers that, because of efficiencies and cost gains, cost minimization techniques, they are able to produce lower prices for the ultimate consumer, which is where you get into the main criticisms that came from people like Bork and most economists.
So your paper that you wrote in 2015, which you've updated, you used a number of examples from cases that have been decided over the years. And you and I talked beforehand about one of the cases, the Woodman Market versus Clorox case. Seemed to have a fact pattern that repeats itself throughout the history of case law in Robinson-Patman Act decisions. You want to use that as an example of the tensions that are set forward?
So when you say that there's a fact pattern, I'm assuming what you mean by that is that typically volume discounts are what is taken to task here. Volume discounts meaning that certain suppliers are able to secure volume discounts, which then makes them, in essence, a favored customer, perhaps, which allows them to compete better in the market than those businesses that don't secure those volume discounts. And currently, that is where the main Robinson-Patman litigation lies, is in those volume discounts. Now, when you look at something, Woodman was ultimately not very successful. So they were upset that Clorox was giving volume discounts, selling bulk packaging to the wholesale clubs that we think about shopping at. And they wanted to know why they couldn't buy those products in that packaging. And that's not just bleach, it's all those other products that Clorox makes. Ultimately, the court said that wholesalers are fundamentally different from your local grocery store, and Clorox shouldn't have to change how they sell it depending on the type of store they're selling to. Now, a big problem with the earlier RP cases is that they didn't require any sort of proof of harm or injury, really, of any kind. And the law has corrected for that a little bit over the years, requiring a little bit more proof that you've actually been harmed, which we expect one to be able to show in antitrust cases. So the question is Woodman harmed by these pricing policies of Clorox? And while you'd have to go through quite a bit of econometrics, as was already mentioned earlier in the podcast, to show that harm and to show the magnitude of it, I'm sure that the harm to Woodman is non-zero, right? Non-zero, not being able to secure bulk discounts for quite a few products that you sell in your store. If they can't acquire their products at a cheaper price, that means that they probably are not going to be able to compete directly on price with their local competitors who are able to secure those discounts. So that means that the harm to them is probably non-zero, and that means the harm to the consumer who shops at Woodman's is likely non-zero as well. Now, how much is Woodman harmed on a grand scale? Does it put them out of business? Probably not. That remains an empirical question. When you look at some of those really earlier cases that were not obvious, what the anti-competitive effects were those of any kind, this Woodman probably has a little bit more of an effect than we would think of those earlier cases that were problematic in a sense.
So there was a period of activity, then there was a period of dormancy, and it seems like we're back in a period of activity again. Maybe you can explain what the philosophy is of the FTC in investigating cases or in using the RPA statute to bring some relief that it sees it needs to bring.
So the period of dormancy came about because of these cases that were much maligned. When I say much maligned cases, I won't go into the details of them, but cases like Utah Pie, Morton Salt, things where it wasn't obvious that providing volume discounts to one business was really having these unintended anti-competitive consequences, that there was probably just, economists typically think of price discrimination as being pro-competitive. Overall, it means we're selling more product in the market, and we like that. Now, today, how did we get from that period of dormancy? So no one really wanted to be bothered with it anymore. We have other antitrust laws to try to handle anti-competitive consequences. Let's not worry about Robinson-Patman anymore. Now, with the current environment, which is this feeling that some businesses are just getting too large, prices are getting too high. The pandemic exploited this idea of why aren't there products on the shelves? Now that there even are products, why are the prices so high? And one place to potentially look at that issue is to say, well, perhaps it's these pricing practices by larger firms. Perhaps it's these larger firms upstream that are playing favorites here that now does not allow most of the rest of the stores to possibly compete on price anymore. So consumers don't like that. Let's try to tackle that by using RP.
I think that's a good segue to turn to Patrick and talk about his experiences in the industry. Patrick, you and I have been talking about the statute and doing this podcast for about a year. I think to Christina's point, a lot of these investigations center around big box versus smaller retailers. Why don't you provide some insights from helping out on pricing strategies in CPG?
Sure. I guess first and foremost, been working with enterprise consumer brands for a long time, and they are extremely conscious about never getting near pricing or an RPA violation. And it is baked into the way they go to market and how they think about things. And within the context of the recent revival, they're very aware. But the thing I find fascinating is that the approach varies widely by brand, especially around the emergence of retail media and how that then pertains to fair and equitable. So what I mean by that is that some brands see this as a pure brand spend, others as pure trade, others a mix by ad product. And it begs an interesting question, really for the lawyers, around the interpretation of RPA. 3 years ago, brands were buying display and video via the trade desk. And it's clearly a brand investment because it's benefiting all retailers. Today, brands can buy the exact same ad via the trade desk still, but using insights to provide more relevant and contextual ads for the consumer. Some brands would then bucket this as now a trade spend. So even though it's the exact same 300 by 250 ad on the exact same site, but because there is some data flowing through it and the ability to attribute it to a sale, some brands would now classify this as trade. And it begs the interesting question, well, is this price support? The brands are all over the place and how they action this in their day-to-day business. I hope to see more coalition around what is the right way to approach this emerging media. Next year, retail media is going to be bigger than linear television. So how it is funded and what is that second order effect to the impact of the retailers is a huge question.
The focus, obviously, for the statute is pricing per se. But other things can be added into a pricing strategy, whether it's sales support or advertising support. You mentioned price support. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing when you're conducting a pricing strategy?
When I look at retail media, what's interesting about it is retail is a famously low margin business, whereas media is high margin. And so there is this question of, if I am a brand and I am shifting dollars to a 90% gross margin business, am I then providing price support and margin support for that retailer? Now, that said, that ignores where were the dollars before. And so if those dollars were on a brick and mortar end cap, well, that's even higher than 90% gross margin. Mm-hmm. So there's this interesting question of, where were the dollars before? Where are they now? And oh, by the way, does advertising benefit all retailers? And the studies that we have done show that it absolutely does, especially when you look at streaming television and the open web.
So in being part of the discussion about pricing strategies, do you think that the people that you talk to have in mind the kind of concepts that form the predicate for antitrust concerns, consumer welfare tests versus protecting competitors? Is that a discussion that happens internally?
Absolutely. Lawyers are thinking through the context of RPA and how is the pricing strategy. And typically what we see is that brands vary pricing by class of trade. That accounts for the variance in cost per serve, as well as then the size of the retailer. So said another way, if I'm shipping 50 trucks of the exact same SKU to Costco, that's highly efficient. If I am shipping one widget to 20,000 7-Elevens, that's highly inefficient, and there's an additional cost to serve. And thus, there will be two different price lists, one for convenience, one for club. And then the brands are typically very disciplined about this. But to me, the interesting question is not necessarily the trade construct, but the brand construct. What is the above the line investment? What is the below the line investment? And then how does that then pertain to how the brands are interacting with the retailers as they become media platforms?
How does a company, a manufacturer, wholesaler, supplier that has multiple product lines deal with these kind of strategies? Let's just say a company has a paper products business and it also sells batteries.
Sure. Each line of business would have its own separate price list. The retailers would then look at it depending on what category they are in. If they are in different categories, they would then be negotiating with different buyers for whatever the trade allocation is and whatever the profitability hurdles are. Now, that said, when the retailer places a purchase order, if the company is able to fill that order out of the same distribution center, there is an efficiency there. So they're just loading up one truck instead of loading up two trucks. So there is the potential for additional value creation via efficiency to be passed on to that retailer just because it is more efficient, and while the brand is still being fair and equitable across all of the classes of trade and retailers.
So to date, most of the investigations and litigation have focused on mega cap companies. Many companies produce, sell, manufacture many products. Is there a calculus that says we're kind of small, so we're going to fly below the radar screen and we're just going to do what we're going to do?
Well, all right, I'm not naming names, but let's just say the smaller the company, the more likely that the price list is written on a bar napkin. And it's not until they start to get larger that they start becoming more disciplined. But quite frankly, the brands that are smarter about price integrity early tend to do better because they don't have channel conflict. And so if there is a variance in pricing by class of trade, that then fuels the gray market and fuels arbitrage, which comes back to bite the brand and is brand degradation. So the smart brands figure that out quickly. If they don't, they're in a world of trouble with retailers yelling at them, and they can quickly see, you can crawl the websites rapidly, see the variance, calculate out what the margin is and whether that's sustainable or not.
Let me draw Christina back in and then we'll turn it to David and John. Christina, we talked about this is a Depression era statute. One question is it a statute that fits modern times? And then a second question is, since the focus has been on mega cap companies, is that legitimate? Is that the way it should be interpreted, that the RPA statute should only apply if you're capped at $200 billion or more? I picked that number arbitrarily, obviously.
To answer your first question, I don't see any reason why it's not particularly applicable the way it's written. It's written in this idea of unfair pricing practices, and that existed back in the 30s potentially, and it also potentially exists today. I think that where the courts have sort of amended it over time has been or could be effective, since we haven't seen many cases, but could be effective in requiring more proof of injury It remains to be seen. But if a case is brought, maybe thinking a little bit more about the consumer effects, which nothing really that I've seen does talk about that. It really only does talk about this idea of protecting competitors. But it is important, no matter what case is brought in the future, that we do want to think about the consumer effects. This idea of harmonizing it with antitrust policy, which says that this protects competition, not just competitors.
Let me turn it to David and John to talk about defending investigations and litigation. So either one of you get a call from mega cap company and they say, well, we just got this subpoena from the FTC, or our client's just been sued. If the issue is proof of unfair price discrimination, what are the econometrics behind disproving that or defending that kind of claim? And then you guys just go on and talk about what your approach might be in defending an investigation or litigation.
Well, maybe I'll kick it off. Talking about how to defend an RPA action or enforcement action is really way too general a question. It's kind of like asking an ER doctor, how do you treat a bullet wound? What are we talking about? Is the bullet in somebody's vital organs? Did it graze the person? Is the person bleeding? Are they in shock? It depends on the situation. With respect to the RPA, I would say, first of all, that the best defense is good compliance hygiene in advance. By far, that's the most useful thing. Do training of your salespeople so they have a sensitivity to it. Have someone, either a designated person or a committee in-house, to review deals, pricing as it comes in, so that you can deal with any potential problem areas in advance of an investigation or a lawsuit. But in terms of defending the lawsuit, I guess I'd divide the things I'd think about into two buckets. One is whether the action sufficiently alleges each of the constituent elements of the statute. And secondly, if necessary, are there defenses that might apply? With respect to the first, aside from the difference in price, which let's assume that there is a difference in price, are these competing purchasers? And that has various aspects to it. If you've got a single store in Brooklyn, New York, and another store in Idaho, let's assume they're not online, they just don't compete with each other. They're not in the same geographic market. They may be at different places in the distribution chain. A distributor is not necessarily going to be competing with a retailer. And the courts generally look at the question of who competes with whom based on commercial realities rather than labels that are attached to the participants. Are the goods of like grade and quality? There can be some thorny questions. Maybe you've got a store brand and a brand name, and they're very similar. Are they really, though, of the same grade and quality? There are often arguments that you can make that they're not. Did the disfavored purchaser suffer competitive injury? And I'm going to come back to that with John, because that is a mixed question of law and economics, and probably more on the economic side. Was the difference in price reasonably contemporaneous? You're not going to be comparing the price of a good 5, 6, 7 years ago with what the price is today. So those are some of the elements that I would look at, antitrust injury being another if it's a claim for damages. And then if you do think you have a potential claim for an RPA violation, there can be defenses that apply. The one that I think about most often is meeting competition. In other words, were you lowering your price to one of your customers to meet competition from one of the seller's competitors? You're permitted to meet competition, not to beat it. But I think of meeting competition as kind of RPA penicillin. It's sort of good for what ails you.
I was going to ask you, David, is that different than cost justification?
Yeah, it is. You can meet competition irrespective of what the differences in cost may be to sell the products to two different customers. Cost justification covers a situation where, similar to what Patrick was referring to, that it may be a lot cheaper to sell truckloads to one large customer as opposed to sending out single boxes to others. Now, the only thing with cost justification is that the way the courts have interpreted it, they've insisted on very detailed sort of showing, and usually it has to be computed in advance. but it is an available defense. Sometimes there also are what they call changing conditions, which are situations where you're dealing with some sort of transient kind of price reduction for seasonal goods or distressed goods or perishable goods. You got a truckload of tomatoes down at the dock and you need to get rid of them or something like that. There is a defense called functional discounts. Those are ones that are price reductions that the seller provides, for example, to a distributor who takes on some of the expense of handling the packages, the goods, shipping them to individual customer sites, and that sort of thing. So there are a host of defenses, and I think that while there are many participants in the marketplace today who have good RPA compliance programs, there also are many that are inadvertently behind the curve. And I would say that's probably both because the RPA has been dormant for quite a few years. And also it's a, frankly, very sort of complicated statute for the average business to really understand. All they know is there's some issue with charging different prices to different customers. But let me circle back to the issue of competitive injury, because this has been the subject of varying interpretations in the cases over the years. Whether a showing of injury in fact is sufficient, probably not, but are we talking about the injury of a particular entity to compete or injury to the competitive process in the market as a whole? And how do those kinds of showings of competitive injury, how can they be reconciled with the objectives of the antitrust laws more broadly? John, I'll let you take it away.
When we talk about the nuts and bolts of what happens, if we go back to David's question, I get a phone call. Oh no, we have an inquiry about the Robinson-Patman Act. I think one of the things that is important to understand as a company, as someone that's dealing with these issues, there's some very basic questions that on their surface sound incredibly obvious and yet actually are pretty complicated. And it starts with, what is a price? What does that actually mean in the context of this? What is a discount? And who is a competitor? And the reason why I say that is because from the position of the economist who'd be working on a matter of this nature, these end up being incredibly data-intensive cases. There are very large volumes of structured and unstructured data that get requested. If you get a civil investigative demand from an agency, they are going to ask you for data on all of the products at issue across quantity, prices, sales, profits, costs, all the customers, geographic areas that are serviced. If you go back to some of David's discussion of the statute, we have to look at commodities, but not services, purchases, but not leases, and what is of like grade and quality. What that translates to often is sometimes data that is literally transaction level, SKU by SKU. So you're talking about a massive data undertaking just to begin to try to understand, do we have a difference in prices at all? So imagine that you sort of are trying to educate a client as to, we're going to have to pull essentially all of your transactional data and start to analyze it to then see if we have a problem or not. But we don't exactly know which price is relevant. So let's take some examples of tricky discounting issues. David referred to some of the things in distribution settings where you have payments for investments, for brand, for marketing, for services. Does that count for the price or does that not count in the price you're comparing? There was a high-profile case in the automotive industry where the allegations were that there were certain incentive payments that were available, but you had to build a showroom for the cars. Was that building of the showroom, was that investment necessary or not in terms of counting? So there's a great deal of complexity. And then in addition to all of that structured data, and starting with the types of economic analyses you might do to first identify where the price differences are, what the basis for them are, which customers receive them in which geographic areas, over what period of time. You've got these diagnostic exercises. Then you also have whatever types of what we call the unstructured data. What do your documents say? What do the meet competition say? So as an economist who would try to get a handle on an issue like this, I would need to understand, obviously, the nature of competition, but that's a pretty broad issue. And so when you start to get to injury, Does it mean simply the existence of an unjustified price difference for one customer versus another in one location across many products? Or is it really about lost sales? Did you literally see lost sales? And so those are the types of issues that I, as an economist, would have to get my hands wrapped around as I try to understand. A firm understanding of the business realities will guide the answers to many of those questions. But it is a massive data undertaking, and where it leads you will be largely explaining differences in prices.
I could tell by the tone of your voice that you would enjoy this challenge.
Well, I'm a little bit of a data geek. So yes, I do love large data sets, although clients might not enjoy this challenge very much when you try to explain to them why it is necessary. But I do think, as David was talking about crafting effective defenses, I do think this is not meant to be self-serving. The reality is the economic reality, the data reality is a very, very important part of any defense of these cases. We have massive quantities of data. We have computing power. That reflects a much broader trend in all of antitrust. But for these types of cases, I think that's one of the different elements about its revival today, even than the cases in the 90s or earlier, because now we even have so much more data to cut and look at these types of questions.
Yeah, and John, you or Patrick can correct me, but I think I'll get the statistics right, that there are online retailers that are pricing their products in 1 million times an hour. It's just a massive data set. So the transactional data isn't just, this is what we're going to do on a Monday. It's how many times or how many thousands or how many hundreds of thousands of times we're going to do this on a Monday.
Absolutely. And again, this is about RPA. We're not even going to start to get into algorithmic pricing on this podcast.
Right.
But the reality is that pricing mechanisms and how companies can adjust prices rapidly is all part of where this heads. Again, not to get ahead of ourselves, but this is a huge issue. And so the broader rubric of pricing, the broader types of things you talk about on this podcast, RPA is one tip of the iceberg, but there's some other issues that are going to intersect pretty nicely with this, I think, that the antitrust authorities are showing real interest in.
Well, in a shameless self-promotion, we did a podcast on algorithmic pricing 2 episodes ago. So anybody that wants to explore that one, go listen to our podcast. We're at the point where we could go on for a while about this subject and everybody's insights, but let's talk about what the future looks like. If you're somebody that's interested in, if you're somebody that's actively engaged in Robinson-Patman Act work, what are you looking for in the future? And we'll just start where we started before. Christina, what are you looking for?
I think you're looking to think about this challenge. It's a fascinating challenge about whether antitrust policy is about keeping prices low or maintaining market fairness for everyone that's in the market. And do those two things go together? Are they mutually exclusive, or is it some combination of the two? And I think that's been the question, and it's going to continue to be the question as more cases should arise.
Pat, you're in the industry. What are you thinking about?
In my mind, the retailers actively want to partner with the publishers because they can show brands that they get higher yield because you can measure efficacy of advertising deterministically and rapidly. So when that happens, as that continues to happen, how does a brand approach this from a customer team perspective as well as a brand team perspective when it's no longer media and retail, but it becomes me-tail? So we expect to see more and more of that going forward.
John?
I guess from my perspective, I think it's going to be interesting to see whether the kind of neo-Brandeis movement, which is essentially what we consider the current regime at the FTC, the DOJ. It'll be interesting to see how that focus shifts. I'm not sure we're not going to see a complete swing where we're going to go from a focus on prices being too low from the RPA to potentially a focus on prices being too high, whether that's from price gouging or price fixing or sort of the more traditional things we see in antitrust. If you asked me to bet, I would suspect it's the latter is where we're going to see more action in the future than on this.
How about you, David?
It seems to me that one of the policy concerns these days is abuse of dominance. And the concern seems to be the power of large buyers. And if you want to address that, it seems to me that the RPA is a pretty blunt instrument for effectuating policy changes. But I think there's some likelihood that cases will be brought. And if they wind up going as far as the Supreme Court, what I'd be interested to see is whether the Supreme Court does with so-called secondary line cases, in other words, challenges brought by disfavored purchasers, what it did several decades ago with regard to primary line cases. In other words, it tried to harmonize, as Christina said, the RPA with antitrust law more generally, and whether it might put a gloss on the statute that would interpret the RPA in such a way that just because one purchaser happens to be disfavored in some respect is not really the concern of the antitrust laws. The question is whether there's sufficient disruption that the field of competition itself is somehow damaged. And I don't know which way it's going to go, but those are some things that I'd be looking for.
For me, I'm looking at the three branches of government. David talked about how the courts might react to cases that are brought. For me, in the executive branch, there have been two rather large investigations that have been open, and the FTC has made noise about actually dropping a lawsuit or a complaint. Don't know why, but it hasn't happened yet. And then, of course, this is both a populist and a technological issue that converges for members of Congress. And so whatever the executive branch does and however the courts interpret what the executive branch does, there's always Congress. And it seems to have a pretty firm foothold. I think that all of your viewpoints are really interesting, and we've done a really good job of explaining the nuts and bolts of the RPA and some of the more interesting issues. So I thank you, my wonderful panelists. We'll call it a wrap.
Thanks a bunch.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to DLA Piper's Pricing Rules podcast. All information, content, and materials contained in this podcast are for general informational purposes only. This podcast is intended to be a general overview of the subjects discussed and does not create a lawyer-client relationship. Statements and opinions are those of the individual speakers and participants and do not necessarily reflect the policies or opinions of DLA Piper, LLP US. The information contained in this podcast is not and should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. No listener should act or refrain from acting with respect to any particular legal matter on the basis of this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. This podcast may qualify as lawyer advertising, requiring notice in some jurisdictions. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. DLA Piper, LLP US accepts no responsibility for any actions taken or not taken as a result of this podcast.